Welcome back, guests. Good to see you, Mike.
Hold on. Kate, I've got late breaking news here.
Okay.
The Canucks have won the cup. The Canucks have won the cup. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
No.
Oh boy, you guys are not sports people.
Calder.
The Abbotsford Canucks won the Calder Cup.
Oh, okay.
For the first time in my life, I've been able to say
awesome.
the Canucks won the cup.
The cup.
And it might be the last time in my life that I'll be able to say it, but folks, the Abbotsford Canucks won the cup. So
that's amazing.
It has to be said. So I feel good about that, Tiffany.
That's good. Yeah, no, thank you.
Silver lining for the Aquilinis.
Yeah. Yeah.
That wasn't my lead on that, actually.
I just wasn't ready for that. You did not. You gave us no
owner, but
you gave us no heads up on that. Okay, thank you, sir. Well, our sports quote content is so much lower than the hurly burly. I'm pleased to have you, or than the curse of politics. I'm pleased to have you add some. All right, and good to see you, Geoff.
You too.
We'll have to raise a glass to the Canucks at the end, the Abbotsford Canucks. Okay, lots to talk about again today. Lots going on. In the strategy suite, we'll spend a little bit more time on extortion in Surrey and how the EB government is handling it. We have a clipping that's going to set us up to talk about the drama unfolding with the BC Conservatives and public sector bargaining. It's on. We'll kick that off and start talking about that. But first, today's guest is one of BC's most experienced politicians, someone with a reputation for tireless constituency work, a former chief of staff, a front bench opposition critic, a party leader, a health minister, and now an energy minister. We're referring, of course, to Adrian Dix. Adrian was first elected to Legislature as MLA for Vancouver Kingsway in 2005 and has been re-elected 5 times. In 2024, he won an intimidating 63% of the vote in his constituency. He's born and raised right here in Vancouver and one of the longest serving members of the Legislature. Welcome, Energy and Climate Solutions Minister Adrian Dix.
It's great to be on the show. I want to ask Mike, does he think Manny should be the head coach of the Vancouver Canucks
now? We may come to regret the choice. Hopefully Adam Foote does okay, but
so sometimes you elect a leader, it doesn't work out, Mike.
Well, that can happen sometimes in sports.
Yeah, in some venues. Adrian, could we take you back to the political venue and what brought you to it? I don't know if I know exactly the story of how you got into politics in the first place.
Well, I tell you, I've been a member of the NDP for a very long time, but I think significant to my becoming an elected politician, which is kind of a second phase in the work I'd done in politics, it really was the 2001 general election. What happened in that election was effectively the elimination of the NDP caucus, except for 2 members. So the area that I was involved in, Vancouver Kingsway, and I worked for former Premier Glenn Clark, guest of the show. I think your favorite guest on the show, Kate.
Most frequently mentioned, yes.
Yeah. He that guy leaves an impression. He leaves a mark on the show.
Have to work on me, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Maybe a few dents, actually.
There you go. So after that election, of course, all of the NDP seats were without incumbents. Like typically a seat such as the one I'm in and others would have had incumbent MLAs, so they maybe come open every 8 or 12 years. And so there we were rebuilding an entire caucus and not entire team. And the party itself was less significant. In fact, the opposition was more broadly in the period between 2001, 2005. Jenny Kwan, Geoff Meggs did a great job in the legislature for us, was in the streets. It was the Hospital Employees Union opposing Bill 29 and so on. And then Carol James became leader of the NDP, I think, in 2004. A bunch of us ran for nominations. A lot of them were highly contested. My own, there were, I think, more than 2,000 members of my riding. In my riding.
Were you contested?
I was highly contested. Yes, it was a contested seat.
Who ran against you?
The person who'd been the candidate in 2001, a woman named Alicia Barcelo, who's a community member. She lives in the community. I won the nomination, then won the election. But really, that generation, we went from 2 seats to 33 seats, and that was the result of what had happened before. There was a kind of a rupture, and there were some people who were connected to the past, people such as Mike Farnworth, who's our House Leader in 2005 and our House Leader, of course, today. But for the most part, we saw a shift, and Carol James did a remarkable job as our leader, both in the 2005 election and subsequently in building out from there. And so that's how I got in at this moment. It was really the result of that election. I almost certainly wouldn't have become an MLA had the NDP not been so badly defeated in the 2001 election.
Do you think having a decisive loss like that in 2001 actually was a good thing for helping the NDP renew?
No.
No.
But
Too big of a loss?
no,
Because sometimes
I think if you look historically, Mike, that sometimes people say, well, a major reform, a major change is good for parties.
yeah.
But what often happens, and you look at parties across sort of the West, you look at social democratic parties or other parties, as they decline, they retreat onto themselves more, right? But what happened in that case was really, I would argue, and you might disagree with this, Mike, but I would argue that it was really a failure of the Campbell government to understand the moment of what they'd done. They'd won 58% of the vote. It was the most comprehensive victory, certainly in modern history of British Columbia. I think you could argue in the history of British Columbia. And they immediately governed for a much narrower coalition than that. They governed for their core supporters, and they did things like break their word to hospital workers, and that was a fundamental change for them, and made other changes, and really didn't govern as if they were trying to meet the terms of their majority. Remember, in the period after the 1996 election, where the Liberal Party had been defeated, they ran a campaign in 2001 that essentially said, and I think we're seeing a bit of this now, where they're going to spend everything and cut taxes on everything. That was it was the most expensive platform ever presented to the public in BC, because they didn't want to leave any vulnerabilities. They felt in 1996, I think, their platform had been a vulnerability. I think that's fair to say. Mr. Campbell had thought that when he lost to Glenn Clark. And that they weren't going to allow any nuance there. They weren't going to say what they were going to do. They were going to spend it all. They were going to do it all, and they were going to pay for it out of some unknown savings, right? And I think it was the Campbell government's behavior, particularly with respect to healthcare and education, but also in other areas, the way they treated with really the imposition of red tape on people on income assistance and so on. They governed like a hard right government when they've been elected really to be the government of all British Columbians. They received, after all, 60% of the vote.
Guess eliminating barriers to interprovincial trade has been one of Canada's economic fitness goals for decades. Until recently, interprovincial trade sat like a dusty old reclining bike in the corner of the basement. But a few casual threats to Canada's sovereignty were all it took to get us up off the couch and thinking seriously about how to take care of ourselves and our economy for the long term. I, for one, am glad we're here, finally taking a serious look at what it will take to achieve stronger national market integration. Because better trade between provinces means better lives for Canadians. It's also something the government of BC has advocated strongly for this year, which is refreshing. And hometown teen TELUS provides the perfect case study. For years, they were the Western Canadian telecom company facing artificial barriers to expanding east, such as infrastructure duplication requirements that contradict the most basic principles of free trade. This, despite the fact that eventually, when TELUS did expand into Ontario and Quebec, consumers in those provinces saw a 13.7% price decrease. Like any new fitness program, getting started on the knotted problems of interprovincial trade can feel a bit daunting. But there's lots we can do, and even the small stuff matters. So we'll talk more next week, guests, about the steps Canada can start taking to get off the economic couch and start looking to the future.
But Adrian, don't you think it was a psychological blow to the NDP as well? Because I know New Democrats who felt, even though there was the huge recovery in 2009, that we weren't ready to govern. There was sort of a sense that we had to spend time in the penalty box and weren't ready to go. And that struck me as one of the really enduring negative legacies of the defeat in 2001.
It may have been, but the public wasn't there. I mean, if you look at the election result in 2005, Carol James got 42% of the vote. She significantly outperformed Gordon Campbell in the debate, and I think we had a good team. We would have formed a good government. So yeah, I think it does affect us. It does affect you. These issues affect you, maybe psychologically. And there was an ongoing legacy. I mean, the Liberals campaigned on the 1990s, through to the most recent election, they were until really they were replaced by the BC Conservatives. I think though what's astonishing about BC political history that it doesn't get said enough, I think, is just the solidity of the NDP base. If you look at every election from 1972 to the present election, really it's 40% plus, no matter who the leader is. There was a limit to that. Like we got this solid vote. The amazing thing is to continue to get such dedicated and loyal support when you're not winning, right?
Mhm.
It's an extraordinary and durable result. And I think that, and that continued to happen except for 2001. So we returned to our base after that. And I think it really shows the commitment of the NDP electorate, which is changing, of course, and the economy is changing. We'll be talking about this perhaps as we talk about energy policy and other things. But really, I think it just shows the real determination of NDP voters to want to see themselves reflected in their government that way. Now, what's happened since then, since 2005, is you saw really in the way the electorate is constructed, the NDP's decline in, for example, rural BC, such that in 2005, we won Caribou South with Charlie Wise and Caribou North with Bob Simpson, who was the MLA at the time. And then subsequently, we by the 2017 election, which was the next time we won an election and became the government effectively, right? That those seats, I think we lost by approximately 34%. So that changed, and there was a dramatic change, and you've seen this particularly in other parts of BC, the suburbs where the NDP does better, of course, are very strong support across Vancouver Island in general, and certainly in the city of Vancouver, which used to be divided east-west and is now divided orange-orange.
Can we extrapolate some of your thinking to the federal election that just happened? And I think it relates to the point you're making about the changing nature of the party, because, what was at the fore was sort of this existential threat from the US, sort of an erosion of sort of, I think principles of free trade that felt safe before, kind of going in a political realignment even around that issue. So maybe I'll take it down to bite size and say, on election night, when you were watching results come in, maybe in the eastern part of the countries and seeing some of those NDP seats, seeing really different results to where the NDP vote was going, coming across the country, what were you sort of thinking? What happened in BC was that what you were expecting?
Well, it was what we expected from the very consistent polls that occurred in the election. Now, I was in a different position. I don't think I've ever worked as hard in a federal election, at least in recent times, since I've been party leader and cabinet minister, than I did for Don Davies this time. And we had a very clear goal, and we won by 0.6% of the vote, which was exceptionally close. Don was, I think, understood everywhere to be the most qualified candidate, one of the best MPs in the country, and we almost lost. On the one hand, it's real. I attribute to Don that we brought it home. So we had a little bit of a different election or a different feeling, but you could feel it out there, particularly in the parts of the riding that Don had not had before. So the parts that have been represented by Harjit Sajjan, you see this, the movement en masse of the NDP electorate to the Liberals. You saw a little bit of this in the 2020.
To the Liberals or the Conservatives?
I guess to the Liberals. To the Liberals, overwhelmingly. And that's where you saw the NDP vote go in general, Mike, I think. The Conservatives, though, got a vote too in Kingsway. They got 24% of the vote, which was an increase of, I think, 10% against the previous time. So they moved up. You saw a little bit of this in the 2024 provincial general election. The Green Party, which was a third party, going from 16% of the vote to 8% of the vote. They lost 50% of their vote, having had a relatively stable vote at a higher level for several elections in a row. I think people who are in the leading parties see third parties as splitting their vote, but actually, generally speaking, third parties have a solid result. I think in the case of these elections, though, people saw very clear choices, and the Conservative Party had significant mobilization on its side, both in the provincial and the federal election. You saw that, but you also saw the center and center left and left electorate coalescing around one side in opposition to that. And those are tough elections for third parties, and they happen from time to time. There was the rejection in 1993, ultimately, of the Mulroney, then Kim Campbell Conservatives, and you saw that movement away from the NDP at that time. And it's an interesting result. The other interesting thing I'd just say about 2001, to go back there, and I know we're going to have current event questions soon, so I'll let it go at that. But you know, you saw ultimately, I mean, you couldn't have had a worse result from the NDP. I mean, we won 2 seats and 21% of the vote, which was 19% less than any other election since 1969. So that is a bad result. But ultimately, the NDP hung together as a coalition. And this does not happen on the right. After 1972, there was a fundamental realignment on the right. The Social Credit Party was a different party after that. In 1991, there was another fundamental realignment on the right. They just broke apart and then came together. The first time under Bill Bennett, the second time under Gordon Campbell. And this happened in 2017, that, you know, as opposition parties, the right in BC, there's not much there. And you see them for a time blowing apart until they mobilize together essentially around
Kate, the Big Bang Theory. Remember?
Every time.
Yes.
And I might add, of course, the realignment that occurred when the NDP won the most votes in 1952. But I think we're losing viewers the further back I go in history.
The CCF, you mean?
No. If they're
At the time, the CCF NDP, the Harold Winch-led NDP or CCF won the most votes, and the electoral system was changed to stop us from forming government. But that's an old story.
Yeah, any listener who can't handle going deep in history, we lost long ago. Don't worry.
Let me get out the violin for you guys.
There we go.
I'm wondering if it's a fair, I kind of picking up on your point too about the left hanging together better than the right. I think that's true, but there's something a little bit different, I think, about what's happening, you know, picking the federal NDP in this election too, because there's this where there might be division and some of those issues that are harder for the NDP. I'll pick climate as an example, which sort of really can struggle with sort of the younger elements of the party and then some of the older roots of the party. What's happened is the electorate's kind of culled almost one part of that NDP coalition. Like there just aren't people getting elected out of those sort of rural manufacturing towns. Like that presence is not there to the same degree, certainly in the federal party right now, compared to the Conservatives who really have everybody and everybody's got to figure out how to get along. So some degree, maybe the electorate's doing this to the NDP or making it more aligned.
Well, federally, you're right. But remember, the federal NDP, even in BC, were relatively strong. We won a lot of seats in the previous federal election, the 2021 federal election, I would say, and the party has real historic strength, right? And if you had polled, and Mike does some of this work, so he sees lots of polls, he knows that if you polled immediately prior to Mr. Trudeau's departure, the federal NDP would have been probably in the mid-20s in BC, I'm guessing, and they lost about half of that support by election day. But what they are a different party, right? I mean, I'm supportive of both, but they're a different party federally. When you are a third party, you are forced to different issues to get traction. You are. The Liberals have occupied a certain space federally, which the NDP often provincially occupies. So if you look at the election in 2020, we got 48% of the vote under John Horgan, which is an all-time record. 2024, 45% under David Eby, which is really the second all-time record. There was an exception in 1979, which I won't bore you with. And if you look at those results, and then you look at the federal results, right, which were pretty good, but they were high 20s. That's a different party, right? That's a different party. And so what happens is in federal politics, there's a much higher standard deviation of results for the federal NDP. Where we're competitive, we do well. And where we're not competitive, we don't do well. And it was one of the problems fundamentally in the elections where we could do well, which are 21, and for Jagmeet Singh, who was an outstanding guy. I got a lot of time for Jagmeet Singh, but you know, one of the things he was unsuccessful at doing for a third-party leader is recruiting strong candidates. Like, why is it that there was George Chow would get, I don't know, 59% of the vote, and I would get 63% of the vote, which is a difference, but it's a 4-point difference. And Don Davies would get 38% of the vote, and we get next door 9% of the vote. And we had a really good guy running everything. He wasn't well known, and it wasn't our election down there. But where you are weak, when your vote is declining, it gets eliminated. That vote gets eliminated, and the deviation between where you're competitive, the the incumbent ridings we held, and all of the other ridings, even those that we held provincially, were very great for the NDP federally. I'm not pessimistic, but what also happens is this: as parties decline, they move towards their base, right? They move towards a certain base of views. And in the NDP's case, the danger is that you move towards the people who are left and not the people who just left, right? And this is a challenge if you're trying to build the federal NDP back. I absolutely believe. I mean, you look at the results of the federal Liberal Party, that there is lots of space for the NDP to come back, as they did in a similar election after 1993, but only if they don't marginalize themselves. And this is going to be really critical for the debate that follows for the NDP. We have to speak to the people who left us, not just to the people, in this case, the 7% who are left. And if we're able to do that, then there's lots of room for the NDP to come back. And we've seen these radical changes in election campaigns as well. And so there is some possibility for the federal NDP, but it'll require a lot of work and a lot of recruitment at the base. If you're running a third party in a campaign and you don't have a strong candidate in a riding, you are telling the voters that you are not competitive in that riding. And that's why you have a couple of options. Things are popping up on my screen, which I'm getting rid of. You have a couple of options in those circumstances, it seems to me. One is to get a candidate in place early and have them do the work. And you see many cases when that happens, where a candidate just canvasses every poll in the riding over 2 years and they make a difference, and then suddenly people know them, right? And they do that work. Or alternatively, to have at least some fairly well-known candidates, people who are like city councilors and others. You saw, Mike will remember this under Mr. Campbell, that I think it's fair to say his slate of candidates was better in 2001 than it was in 1996, and a lot of that was from his base as the president of the EBCM and his work in municipal politics, which assisted him in that task. And so I really encourage the NDP not just to listen to its strongest views, but also to listen to the voters who left and the people who need representation in a country where inequality and climate change and lots of issues that the NDP could have strong hold on will be there.
Pop quiz from our sponsor this week, listeners. What is a deep energy retrofit? Well, it's more than just a renovation. A deep energy retrofit is a comprehensive upgrade to an existing building that significantly improves its energy performance. We're talking better insulation, tighter air sealing, and high-efficiency mechanical systems, all working together to cut energy use and emissions. Why does it matter? Because buildings are responsible for over 10% of BC's greenhouse gas emissions. Earlier this spring, FortisBC hit a big milestone, the completion of deep energy retrofit upgrades at Manor House, a 50-unit affordable rental building in North Vancouver, originally built in 1972. This project is part of a $50 million pilot program to find the best ways to cut energy use in older homes and multifamily buildings across BC, key to meeting BC's climate goals. The target? A 50% or greater reduction in whole building energy use. That means lower energy bills for building owners and keeping rent low for tenants. For buildings like Manor House, it also means helping keep rents affordable and ensuring residents live in a safe, healthy home that's built to last another 50 years or more. Hey FortisBC, how do I go about getting a deep energy retrofit at Hotel Pacifico? I mean, there's a lot of hot air. Anyways, FortisBC. Energy for a better BC and a better podcast. So one of the interesting aspects of the provincial and the federal election was that the Conservatives certainly did quite well in ridings that BC Liberals hadn't really done that well in the past, like North Surrey, for instance. And there was a pretty strong positive reaction to the Conservatives in the Chinese community and South Asian community and among younger voters. Yet the NDP became the party of some affluent ridings, like on the North Shore and with older voters. The NDP are doing very well with plus 55 voters in the provincial election. And federally, that replicated with the federal Liberals doing very well with that crowd and the federal Conservatives doing well with younger, diverse voters. The one thing I'll add to that, too, is that on the student vote for the under 18s, the Conservatives did very well. So do you see that as a bit of a demographic time bomb for progressives? That conservatives are doing well with younger people, diverse, growing communities, possibly driven by affordability and those types of issues?
No, I think it's a message though to the NDP, to us, and one that I'm personally fairly actively engaged in, which is that electorates change and they move.
Hmm.
And there was a moment, I think, around the second election of President Obama in the United States. People said, well, the demographics are moving in the favor of the Democrats, right? They're not saying that now, right? Because
Hmm.
some of those electorates changed. And we have historically talked about what Mr. Campbell did to hospital workers, which had a fundamental effect in a number of communities. I mean, he singled them out, he laid them off, he cut their salaries in half, and he disrespected their work, in my view, right? And he wouldn't see it that way, of course, but that's what I did. And that's how people felt it. I'm telling you, on the ground, that's how people
Hmm.
felt it. And they were not wrong. The largest layoff of women workers in history. There wasn't a person in some communities, the Filipino Canadian community, very active in healthcare, as you know, that didn't know somebody who had been negatively affected by Mr. Campbell. Well, that community, you cannot take communities for granted. The NDP was first in the South Asian community, effectively desegregating BC ferries in the 1990s. All the work that was done by the IWA and really political legends like Mosa Hoda and Harry Baines and others, all that work doesn't assume support in that community going forward. We've got lots of support in the South Asian community. I know I do personally. My riding is one of the most diverse in all of BC. I got 63% of the vote. I've been in the 60s the last three elections, right? So you can't assume that. So we've got to do some work here in assessing that. My view is what has happened in terms of public policy. One of the challenges that faces the NDP is as a government, as the party of government now, we've been in government for 8 years, is the dramatic population increase of the province, which puts fundamental pressure on social services, right? And if you look at any objective measure of what we did in healthcare, and I promise I won't talk more about healthcare. I think I made that promise to my colleagues a little while ago, but I promise I won't talk too much about healthcare. But if you look at the 3 years between 21 and 24, BC added 540,000 people to MSP. That's 11% in 3 years, population on top of an aging population coming out of a pandemic. And it's in the areas that saw the greatest population increases, south of the Fraser, where you saw the greatest pressure on services in hospitals, because it takes a while to build hospitals, the greatest pressure on, and on schools, right? So you see that increase in population. And you saw that in the United States with respect to immigration as well. And those were the areas that we were representing. And we invested more on healthcare in Surrey than you can imagine, are continuing to do so. But that was lost in the immediate term, I think, in people's minds on increases in population. So you've got to represent, and that's part of the work we're going to do. I think that the NDP has every chance of winning seats back in Surrey, but we got to do the work and engage with people and be with them and hear what they're talking about, and do political work.
Yeah, but
Equally, I would say on the other side, some of the voters who left because the Conservative Party, I don't know what your assessment is, but my assessment is ran a less than impressive campaign last time in terms of candidates, in
Provincially
terms
or
of leader,
federally or both or
provincially,
provincially? Okay.
provincially, held their vote. So they started the election with 43%. They ended the election with 43%. They didn't lose a lot of vote, you could argue, although maybe some people moved around. But they lost a number of voters. You can't depend on that happening every election. So we have the best leader, we have the best team, we have the best policies. That doesn't mean you necessarily win the election all the time.
And
As
you also
I've
have
learned,
you also have a government that's a bit long in the tooth.
no, I wouldn't say that, Mike.
You don't think so?
And you know as well as I do that sometimes the best candidate
You're a
doesn't win an
history
election.
buff. You know what happens to governments going in for a fourth term, or you're
Well, I think this, I think that the energy of our premier, who is dynamic and, people will say extremely intelligent. I don't want to get into that side of it, but also very empathetic with people. I think the government has a lot of strength and momentum and enthusiasm. I see much more energy on our benches than on the opposition benches. And I'm delighted with our new team of people. We've got, a dynamic, diverse group, and John Horgan deserves a lot of credit for this, and Carol James and some other leaders, but for transforming the NDP. But we've got a younger, more dynamic bench on our side, and I think I have a lot of confidence in the future because of that. When I look at colleagues such as Nikki Sharma or Ravi Kalan or Ravi Parmar, or I go down the list now. Now I get in trouble for not naming people, right? But when I look at that generational change, I have a lot of confidence for the future. A lot of confidence for the future.
But let's go back to the healthcare thing for 1 minute, because you're the longest serving healthcare minister, I think, in provincial history. Went through all kinds of difficulties, including the pandemic and the huge surge of population you've talked about. But looking back on it, and this is not an invitation to criticize or not criticize anybody or anything, but what is the main issue that you wish you could explain to voters in more depth? Because the NDP aspires to be the party that defends healthcare, and beleaguered now by, emergency room issues and shortages of staff and so on and so forth. Is there one thing that you took away from that experience that you wish more people could understand and see?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the pandemic obviously had a profound effect, and I think, I take responsibility for this. I don't think people quite understood how profound an effect it had on the system. I mean, we were going to do everything we did before, right? However well or inadequately in people's minds, and we were going to add a worldwide pandemic, and there was a second public health emergency, of course, which is the overdose public health emergency. So these are just massive challenges, and in the face of that, the record on surgeries, on diagnostics, on primary care, on the number of people attached, on the number of new doctors, the number of new nurses, by any standard in Canada, was fantastic. People don't, of course, care whether we're better than Ontario or New Brunswick. They don't particularly care about that. But I think we need to do a better job saying, well, here are the challenges, and here's what we're doing, and here's why public health care is the answer to it. And what I find extraordinary, and this was partly because of the pandemic. I certainly didn't get the opportunity to communicate this directly, and other people didn't get it as much. We built a hospital in Fort St. James, Geoff. You'll remember this. It was something that Premier Horgan felt passionately about, and I felt passionately about, having been there. Let's tell people who don't know Fort St. James very well. They had a temporary modular hospital that was built in 1972 that was supposed to last till 1982, right? They had repeated government side representation, including John Rustad, for a long time, and they didn't do anything. So the thing was in lamentable condition. Now, there is no way on earth in a privatized system that we would be investing in a hospital in Fort St. James. That would not happen. Public health care is most important in rural areas, but rural areas do present a challenge because of some changes in public health care. So, I think you have to lay out what the situation is, but the public health care response, I would argue that public health care is more important to people's health in BC than it has ever been before. And we've got to make that case better. I think people saw it in the pandemic, but what happens naturally during crises is that people want to move beyond them at a certain point. It's at a certain point, you're getting lots of attention. Like, I would give answers like this all the time, Mike, of this length.
I don't think anyone's arguing about.
It was an extraordinary public response here. And our response was the best because we brought everyone together. Terry Lake, Daniel Fontaine worked for the care providers. We did an exceptional job bringing everybody together in a public health care response. We worked with unions and supported staff in a way that nobody else did in Canada. And we had the best results in Canada, the best results in North America. I would argue the best results in the world in COVID-19. And of course, one might expect that would lead to a celebration of that system. It was our public healthcare system that did it, and it was leaning into our public healthcare system that did it. And that was something that Premier Horgan thought was important, and we did it differently than everyone else. And but immediately after that, and you'd be interested in polls. I think these things are talked about in public polls. We've been polling a lot of the time. There's a lot of polling around healthcare in that time. I think we lost our support on healthcare. We went from 60 to 65%, and I think it was, I'm trying to even remember the year, whether it was 23 or 22. It's from March to April, to about 30% in 1 month. after that time because other issues came back as a wash, and the system was responding to it, but it faced multiple challenges. But I think the important thing to note is that it's public health care we need to maintain and to improve public health over time. And I'm proud of the things we do together and what we do in BC. And by the way, we do it more efficiently. People who know the country know that in Alberta, where they have all kinds of privatized schemes, they spend way more on healthcare with poorer results.
You might not think of them when you think of healthcare, but when you or someone you care about needs a definitive diagnosis, life-saving treatment, and help with recovery, you will. That's why this message from our new sponsor, the Health Sciences Association of British Columbia, is so important. They're BC's respiratory therapists, lab technologists, radiation therapists, physiotherapists, imaging technologists in sonography, MRI, and CT, and members of over 60 other specialized health professions. They're the critical links in a healthcare system that works, a system that saves lives. But for too many of them, just doing their job can be a fight for their own survival. Staying late, arriving early, working extra shift after extra shift, because BC's health science professionals are understaffed, overworked, and just not paid enough. And that has to change. And it can. With fair pay, we can end the shortages of BC's specialized healthcare professionals, because if we don't help them, they can't help us.
So I think I'm hearing the hints of a diagnosis here, but I want to put a couple pieces you've put to us back together and then bring it back to polling. Because, I've heard you say, this government isn't long in the tooth. Exactly. I've heard you say, we are investing a ton in Surrey and in healthcare. I think acknowledging maybe a bit of a drop of the ball after the pandemic and recovery, but sort of saying doing all the right things there. I heard you say the Conservatives didn't run a really strong campaign in the last election. So help me understand then, what would you say did happen with the polls in that kind of space, right? In early 2024 up to E-Day, there really was this kind of, I wouldn't call it a cratering of the NDP. It was more the rise of the Conservatives, right? But there was what looked like certain victory became a really close race. What happened?
Well, there was no certain victory. I didn't believe in any certain victory. There isn't for the NDP. I mean, if you look at the 2020 election where we were in, say, 23, we'd won the popular vote in exactly one election in a row. And, that doesn't make a dynasty. I don't think, Mike, it doesn't make a dynasty in hockey. It doesn't make a dynasty in politics. We'd gone from consistent elections. So we'd gone 42% in 05, 42% in 09, 40, 40, and then 48, right? And in this election, Premier Eby got 45, which is objectively for the NDP an excellent result. Every election is close in BC. Every election is contested. And it was always my assumption, and I think it was Premier's assumption, everyone else's assumption, that the opposition would bring itself together at some point. There was that period, and really what we saw in the election campaign, the period leading into, was a reorganization of the opposition, right? And this has happened multiple times, and it happened this time in favor of the BC Conservatives, that the BC Liberal Party and then became BC United, never really adjusted to its role in opposition. And I would argue the single thing that hurt the most was campaign finance reform. That it used to be you get individual donations of millions of dollars to the Liberal Party, and they would dominate any other thing because they had the money from downtown Vancouver. And after there was campaign finance reform, you had to go and actually recruit supporters, and a distributed financial and political support. They didn't and couldn't adjust to that. For us, the election's dynamic, and we've got to do a better job, I would say, if we're going to continue to win elections, of appealing to growing segments of the population, and we have to win in the suburbs. We just do, and we didn't do as well in Surrey. We didn't. It was mixed. We got, I think, overall support in Surrey was, I think, in the mid 40s. I don't follow these things closely, but so we didn't do badly. But we have to see the trend going against us there and respond to it by engaging with people, and that means listening to what they say. And if people disagree with us on 20% of things, not becoming ourselves, dismissive, but in fact engaging with people who will agree with us on 80% of things. And that was, you probably heard John Horgan say, I think Geoff would have heard John Horgan say many times, they're all New Democrats, they just don't know it yet.
That's
Well,
right. Yeah.
that's what you have to do, but we can't assume the rest. And I think overall party loyalty is declining in this context. So I think you have to go win the votes every election. So I don't think those 45% that voted for us last time are ours. We got to go win them back and win some more, because we're going to lose some of those, and you got to win some more if you're going to continue to
Well,
win
your government's arguably in a bit of a tough spot right now, more than a tough spot given the fiscal situation and all these growing demands, as you well know, from healthcare, which eats government from the inside. So you've got a job to do to spur economic growth, to bring in tax revenue. So let's segue over to your work as Minister of Energy.
Well, you did that well, Mike.
What's your
you're now
plan?
Officially a podcaster.
Nimble
You're now
bridge,
officially
yeah.
a podcaster. I like that.
Well, somebody had to do it.
Let's get him off the 1979 election. Let's move on to energy policy.
he does it well because it's usually us
hour
doing it to
3 of
him.
the podcast. We'll get the energy here. But what is your? I mean, this is a really interesting position you're in as minister, because you're really at the nexus of some really been contentious policy debates over, economic growth, climate, Indigenous. There's a lot of different factors. Certainly, I assume we're trying to thread the needle on it, but you've got right on your front burner plate is LNG projects in Northwest BC with electricity transmission tied up on that, with electricity supply issues, on and on and on. I'll just give you some runway here. What's your plan?
Well, first of all, act with urgency. When I started is to bring back the healthcare comparison in COVID-19 between March 15th and March 30th of 2020. Probably made 30 of the most significant decisions I'll ever be involved with. Geoff Meggs was involved with them as well. And we moved quickly, and sometimes we got it wrong and we adjusted. We adapted. And so our position on a lot of questions evolved over time, because I think we had leaders who did that. In this case, I see a similar urgency at this level. The province, to address climate change and to address the potential growth in our economy that we need to do exactly what you say, needs to dramatically increase its production of electricity. So we had the new government. It was formed in November of this year. I became Minister of Energy. We announced the results of a call for power. We announced immediately that the wind projects in that call for power would be exempted from environmental assessment, something that became real in Bill 14. We then take steps to move the regulation of those to the BC Energy Regulator, and we established all of those projects essentially had majority First Nations ownership. So it was a dramatic change. And that is power the size of Site C. And then in May, we're doing it again, another call for power. We need more electricity. If you don't have electricity, if you don't have clean power, then if you've got a rising population, those 500,000 people I talked about in healthcare, they're using electricity as well. Take a drive through Brentwood one day and see the transformation of that neighborhood. You see that. So we're going to need more power. And so the only alternative to not delivering clean power is to deliver a fossil fuel-based power, right? So to be worse off in terms of climate change. So I am very optimistic. And my view is, though, that there's absolute urgency in this, and we've acted with that kind of urgency. You've seen that from the government on all of those questions in the last while, including the need not just for intermittent power such as wind, but for firm power, which is part of our action plan that we announced in the beginning of May. So it's been action, action, action on the electricity side. And as Donald Trump moves away from that, well, the rest of the world and the invested world is actually moving towards renewable electricity. I think we are on the right side of that. We got to lean in. The road on climate change, everyone wants it. You want it to be a straight line, and sometimes that appears that way in climate plans and so on. It's not a straight line, but fundamental to everything we do on climate change is that, and in terms of economic development. In addition to that, you need transmission. So we're building the North Coast transmission line, which requires a fundamental change in BC Hydro's approach to these policies. Now, BC Hydro is great and does an extraordinary job, but this period is similar to the 1960s, I'd argue, where we need hydro, BC Hydro, to do all the great things it does in terms of low power rates and everything else, but also to lean a little bit more into risk. So we're building the North Coast transmission line in advance of orders for power because we believe they're coming. And we believe if we wait for the orders, that we will delay the economic development. This is a major change that's happening at BC Hydro, and you see it in those policies around the North Coast transmission line. And you mentioned other issues such as LNG, but I'd just say broadly, we need to move more closely with other jurisdictions. You know, I've said a number of times, you might have heard me say it, Mike, that I think that if Nigeria and, formerly Hugo Chavez, Venezuela and Saudi Arabia can work together in OPEC, then we should be able to get along with Alberta a little better. So we're working on issues like the intertie with Alberta, right? Where we're coming together and working on these issues where there are joint interests between our provinces. And that gives both of our provinces, it's not just an issue of the oil and gas industry, or for us, the natural gas industry, but gives both of our provinces more authority. It's not necessarily good for them, but it's good for the public interest that the two provinces are not being whipsawed.
Public education is where futures begin, where students build confidence, form friendships, and discover their potential, from future tradespeople to healthcare workers, educators, and more. But today, more and more families, schools, and communities are feeling the strain. Rising costs, aging schools, and staffing shortages are stretching our education system thin, and it's students who are paying the price. When programs disappear or support staff are reduced, kids lose more than just services. They lose opportunities to learn, to grow, to thrive. But the British Columbia School Trustees Association and BC's Boards of Education believe it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a future where every child walks into a well-supported classroom, where educators have what they need, where school trustees get to add programs to improve their school, and no student is left behind. With increased investments in education, we can build the strength of public education, increasing supports, expanding opportunities, and creating a more equitable future for every learner in BC. Because when we invest in education, we invest in all of us. Learn more at bcsta.org/advocacy.
I was going to say your government's gone down a fast track approach to both in terms of the fast track list that I think January or February it brought out, but also the recent legislation, Bill 14 and 15, to make projects happy, presumably to do the things you're talking about, create jobs and drive revenues for government. What are you hoping to see in your ministry? What are you trying to enable?
Well, first of all,
clean energy projects, of course.
Clean energy projects, all the electrification of the province, and it's a fundamental public policy notion, I think, that and it's one of the reasons why we see a declining support for the institution of government in regions like the Northwest, and we lost a seat. One of the best, politicians, BC kind of recent years politicians, Nathan Cullen, we lost that seat. And part of it, I think, is that people in the Northwest are facing a fundamental lack of access to power. It even affects the residential service they sometimes get in that region, but a fundamental lack of access to power that's produced in the North. That power in the North and the peace system coming down to the Lower Mainland, but not being used in the Northwest. So I think this is a significant political change as well. But I think what's also important is the notion of First Nations ownership, and that means that the benefits, for example, of wind power production will stay in the regions that they're being, that the wind farms or whatever are existing in, and not just benefit for industry a ways away, but benefit in general. So I think that is critical for the economic development of the province, and we benefit from all the investment by multiple governments in the past in 100% people owned by the people Crown Corporation like BC Hydro. That allows us to do that. I'd say secondly, you mentioned natural gas. I think we've got clearly some of the best natural gas reserves in the world. Under our government, the NDP government, we have between $40 and $50 billion in LNG projects under construction. And I think most governments, and I'll go further than that, the best LNG projects in the world in terms of emissions. So, and that's because we put that on the table. That was Premier Horgan and Premier Eby's direction, that we put such an approach on the table. And it is a competitive advantage, the latter and the former, to us around the world. And so I think we have to, and so we have to talk about that. I don't know, what you would advise a government to do, but I think most governments, if they'd had that level of private sector investment in their province, would be talking about it more than we do. Mm-hmm. So I've been engaging that, and you've heard me do that. And there are other projects before us. It is an advantage to us when we talk about the national effort of electrifying the Montney. It's an advantage for us to have low emission LNG. It's, when people compare, I sometimes hear people compare LNG to coal. I think that's too low a standard to compare it to. You compare LNG to LNG projects, what we are displacing around the world are high emission LNG projects, either in the United States or in places such as Qatar. And I think that has some advantages to us. So we have to address the climate issue, and it enables us to have the best product to sell around the world. And I'm convinced we could do that. And we'll see some of the decisions to come. LNG Canada 2 is largely a decision that will be made by the joint venture partners in that case. There's other projects that are in the EA process for LNG, and we'll see what happens, and they have to meet all the difficult tests that they have to meet. But I think this is enormous opportunity, and on climate for us, on electrification for us, on economic development for us, and I mean us as a province, and around really being leaders in all of these areas. And this will drive economic development in our province. It's not the only thing that will. It won't deal with everything. But I think it's very exciting, and it's the right response to what's happening in the United States for us on energy policy.
Well, we just had news yesterday, I think, that the very first production from LNG Canada was achieved the last night or the other day, very recently in any case, and so they'll soon be in production. But there's a new controversy with Alberta over whether or not there should be another oil pipeline, and you've participated a bit in that debate. Is it a case of bring us a project and we'll assess it, or you should not bring us a project? Can you walk us through the government's thinking on that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of pipelines, Geoff. I would have brought it up myself if I didn't know it would come up.
A perennial favorite in BC politics.
It's particularly of mine. But if you look back at we just built a project, right? The TMX pipeline, which was the twinning of the existing line. And so you'll be surprised, a little bit of a longer answer here. We did this project. The federal government essentially purchases the project in 2018. It's supposed to take $7.4 billion to build this project. By 2020, it's at roughly 13 or 14 billion. By 2022, 21 billion. By 2023, 30 billion, and finally $34 billion. So 4.5 times what it was originally supposed to cost. It's operating over the last 6 months on average at 80% capacity. And so we're coming in to the Port of Vancouver, coming out, and we can't, after $34 billion, we can't even get the ships that would take a maximum amount of the result oil out of the harbor. So they have to go out 70% full. That's what we have. That project has significant capacity increase for a relatively low cost. So TMX itself has a proposal, I think, in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 billion that would increase by 245,000 its capacity for almost nothing. So what is the case for a $50 billion pipeline across the north exactly? What's the case for that? There is no business case. It's a very challenging route, as one would expect. You can go over mountains sometimes, natural gas pipelines. You got to go through valleys for oil pipelines. Hundreds, thousands of streams. It's a difficult project, and that's why there's no proponent. Now, I know the government of Alberta is making considerable efforts to sort of bring about a proponent. But if you look at TMX, We own it. The people of Canada own it. All of you own it, and I own it, and everyone else owns it. We own this. We're trying to sell it. The government of Canada is trying to sell it. They can't find a buyer. Why? Because probably the amount they could get for it is substantially less than, say, $34 billion. So that would lay out what the public subsidy is. So why not use what we have and what we have at much lower cost rather than build another pipeline that would involve lifting the tanker ban, which is a signature Liberal Party initiative dating back to 1972, I think, Mike. I think I got the time right. That was David Anderson, federal
David
MP.
Anderson, yeah.
Federal MP at the time before he became a provincial politician. Did that. And so I would say that that's our position. And our position is more than that. Like, they're real projects right now. We need to act right now. The federal government has indicated they have right now. We have real projects, including projects such as the North Coast Transmission Line and the Alberta Inside that are in the national interest right now. And so why don't we proceed with real projects instead of having this ever interesting debate about projects that don't yet exist and really don't make sense for us.
I don't think you're going to get your wish on that one. I think we're going to still be having that debate. But
sure. And that's fair. But let's also focus on the things that we can do, which are significant together, including with provinces such as Alberta. I think what the Premier's saying is that he's prepared to work with people. He's been leading. That BC is going to lead the economic development in the country. And that's what he's saying. And I think he's absolutely right for the reasons that I've going to say. But, I understand that there's politics here and there's important politics involved for the people of Alberta. But what we need are real projects and not social enterprises.
All right.
Well, I think that's where you have that opportunity. I know, Kate, you probably want to transition here.
It's okay.
But I think
you give one, you take one today, Mike.
I would argue the political opportunity for your government and frankly for the Carney government is to show the results on it. There is a pretty strong provincial consensus to have these projects, right? I'm not just talking about LNG. I'm talking about mines. I'm talking about clean energy.
Yeah.
People want, and especially in the suburbs, the vote-rich suburbs, they want to see it happen, right? And there's always people that are going to express concerns, and your curse is that a lot of them are inside the NDP who have strong environmental views, and that's your coalition, and you guys know how to manage that. But I think if there are, Carney and Hodgson are very bullish compared to Trudeau and Wilkinson. It's a totally different tone change. So, my observation is it's good politics for the middle to put some wins on the board there.
I think it's good politics for everybody. Mike, this is where I disagree. I think that there's a tendency to try and judge politics as to where you are on the political spectrum. I think everybody wants to get things done. I think if we're going to address issues of inequality, creating tens of thousands of unionized, high-paying jobs is a good thing for society, and that will build what is always been a left view, upgrading our resources, which is something we historically haven't done. I'm going to talk about books in a second, I think.
I'm trying to get to them.
One of the best books ever written in BC is written by your colleague, Mr. Meggs there. I'll call him that, Professor Meggs.
Yeah.
The book that Geoff Meggs wrote in 1991, that's before he really got involved in politics, and his ability to write deteriorated somewhat. On the decline of the salmon fishing industry, it shows some of that dynamic, right? The inability we've had in our province, which has had, and the dynamic between profit and sometimes racism and everything else has limited our potential and our growth. I think we've got unlimited potential, unlimited growth, and I think for me, that's a, if you want to use the old terms, that's a politically left idea, but that's a great idea of what we need to do, which is upgrading our resources here in BC and creating more value for them, which is something we didn't historically do because resources were so plentiful.
All right.
I happen to agree with you
on the book
that there is a grand bargain available that unites a lot of these things. So
and we have to do it. I think people are becoming too. I think often there's a little Coke and Pepsi division in society, in political society, in political elites, where, and I tried to make this case notably and unsuccessfully in 2013, was that some of the issues that appear to divide us don't divide us, right? And that there's a need by political parties to create divisions that don't exist in society. Argue that, and that, and there are real issues where there are divisions. I think healthcare is one of them, and I'm a passionate and will continue to be a passionate supporter of public healthcare and public education because I think we need it in society, and it's fundamental to our society. But I think there's a tendency on the forest industry, for example, it's really significant. Successive trade agreements limited the scope of decision making. It wasn't like the old days in the 60s and 50s and 40s where people there were profound differences between the left and the right on how to manage forestry and the role of workers and so on. Now there's smaller differences, and we should recognize those and have a serious debate about them. And I think in doing that, you bring people back to the process.
So bringing people back to the library, can I get your recommendations for the summer? And I'm hoping you're gonna, for book reading, and I'm hoping you're gonna lead off maybe with Geoff's book.
Well,
yeah,
Geoff's book. So let's just say, I think Geoff, I'm right. It was written in 1991, around that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I was looking at it a bit last night, and first of all, it's beautifully written, and it's a different book. I think more of your listeners will be familiar with the book that Geoff and Rod Mickleborough wrote, which I would call a more traditional journalist book. This is both extremely readable and kind of an academic book as well, a serious book. You don't get many opportunities, and all the things I'm going to be talking about here today look at the long view of life in British Columbia, and this is one of them. The fishing industry has defined many of the differences in BC society on issues of racism and how the industry is organized, on labor, of course, on the way that we deal with the resource. We didn't often treat it very well, I think it's fair to say. And government was heavily involved in that regulation as well, and sometimes failed in that. In this case, largely the federal government often failed in its regulation of the industry. So it's just a remarkable story. I think I've happened to have read all of Geoff's books, but this one I think is one of the best books written about.
Can we just get the title
BC
of
history.
that again?
Yeah, I need a title. Salmon, the decline of the Pacific fishery.
Okay, there you go.
But I must say it's hard to find. Thank you, Adrian. And also, I regret that my gloomy forecasts in it turned out to be, for the most part, true. So it's not a happy ending book.
Even you stop in 1991, in some ways, it's the end of that particular story. Sadly, and everything that had occurred up to that point got worse. I got a couple other things I want to show you. I got here. One of them, and this is part of a two-part series. It's by a guy named. So I listened. You did was it a Christmas special about books
with Baldry?
Yeah.
You were
with Keith Baldry, and I was
withering in your criticism of his choices.
Yeah, well, aside from choosing his own book, which I thought was a bit interesting. But anyway, I'll say that. Here's one, Martin Robin, right? One's called The Rush for Spoils, which is BC 1871 to 1933. He was an SFU professor. 1934 to 1972 is the second book. He wrote the book in 73, just as the Barrett administration was starting. And I believe Martin Robin is still alive. He wrote them as quite a young scholar. And these are fun books about BC history. You can find about motion.
Yeah,
you can find out, Mike, about by-elections in 1937 that had a real effect on the Botelho government. So that level of detail, but also a lot of fun. He has an avowed point of view, which is on the left. So therefore good. No, I'm kidding. And but also really interesting. And I don't think it's as rigorous a book, but I really recommend it to people who want to get a sense of the passage of time in BC history. It's just remarkable. And the other is another series of books which I have, which is
he's getting 5 books in under the cover of
I know.
Oh well,
it's like us at the minibar. It's good.
So there it is.
It's on brand.
it's Patricia Roy. I couldn't believe this wasn't on your list of books, Geoff. I was very disappointed in you at that thing, I have to
It's on my
say.
shelf. It's on my
You
shelf.
know, I was going to make a, I was going to make a post in the comment page actually about it, but it's called White Man's Province, and then there's two other books, and it's by Patricia Roy, who's a UBC professor, and it really details racism in our province and the history of our province right to 1967 when the Immigration Act changes from 1858. And, you know, British Columbia, people know this, I think passed in the neighborhood of 140 to 150 racist laws. No other jurisdiction in Canada did this, right? This was, we put in place and codified segregation in a way that no one else had done. And it had a profound effect on our history. And Patricia Roy's book, which are, I would say, more rigorous than Martin Robbins' books, are just remarkable to read. I think for people interested in the history of the province and the different forces that have shaped who we are today, they're compelling, and I really recommend them. And one more book.
One more.
Let me guess.
One more.
Barbarians in the Garden City.
I'm just reading for myself. There's a British Columbia author named Maria Reva, and her book called Endlings. She's Ukrainian Canadian author. Is, I think, one of the best novels I've read in a long time. She's a BC author, has been reviewed in the New York Times and other places and all those things. She was just on the Seth Meyers show, which is almost as good as being on Hotel Pacifico.
Almost
Yeah,
as second good. Place.
Yeah. Almost as good.
That calls us all the time.
Second place to that, but it's truly, if you want to read something that's truly summary, that is profound and I think unbelievably funny and entertaining. Well, very sad. Ms. Reva is Ukrainian Canadian, of course, and as she was writing the book in real time, which was set in the Ukraine in real time, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and so changed the book, and you can see that in the writing of the book. So I really recommend that. BC author, great book. Wonderful for summer while you're reading these long histories of British Columbia.
Minister Dix, on behalf of the staff at Hotel Pacifico, I would like to apologize for your disappointment for our book episode. You are probably like our front audience for that one, so we'll check in with you next time.
I'm your base, Kate.
Yeah. We'll make sure we'll do our due diligence next time and get some recos from you next time we venture into books. And thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you on today.
Hey, thank you for having me on the show. Sorry for the long answer.
You're not
sorry. Not sorry. Yeah. Okay, that was a great chat. I'm going to bring us back to some of way back in the distant past. So let's whip ourselves back to the present. I mean, there was a bit of both, but let's talk about an issue that I think we introduced last week, talking to Mayor Locke, but it's still sticking around, is this issue of extortion in Surrey. And I want to start with you, Geoff, because I'm curious. I mean, the move the EB government has made now is to reach out to the federal government to ask them to declare it's the Bishnoi gang a terrorist group. Can you walk us a bit through who they are?
It's very, very hard to know who they are, but Lawrence Bishnoi is a notorious gang leader in the Punjab in India who's in custody, but according to the government of India, still runs a transnational crime network from jail. I'm not sure how he's able to do that, but he does. And it's widely believed in the South Asian community, and I think it's been kind of endorsed by some police voices, that someone somehow connected with the Bishnoi gang may have been acting as an agent of the government of India when they shot Mr. Nijjar, who was the Khalistani supporter who was shot in his temple parking lot 2 years ago. 2 people have been convicted for that, but they have not said who hired them. And of course, they never will. So when the EB government was looking for a response to some of the attempts to extort, well, it's a very widespread problem in several parts of the country, under pressure to show some action, Premier Eby challenged the federal government to declare the Bishnoi gang a terror organization. which is interesting because that's what has happened now thanks to Trump's intervention in the fentanyl smuggling thing. He demanded that we treat criminal gangs, especially cartels, as terror organizations. And the effect of that is to lower the bar. Many people would say not far enough, to make it easier for police to secure evidence, lay charges. Generally makes it much tougher. If you're actually involved as a terrorist, you're going to face a lot more heat under a terrorist designation than you would be if you were just a simple transnational criminal who was terrorizing people. So it's an interesting move. We'll see what the federal government does with that, because they're expected to list a number of cartels as terror organizations and have agreed to do that as part of the response to Trump's fentanyl export concerns. Interesting push.
There's lots going on with this one. And, I think just before we started taping with Minister Dix, he was mentioning how yesterday he was at the memorial for it was the 40th anniversary of the Air India attack. And I'd, just thinking of sort of all the kind of different issues at play here, the Air India attack sort of does feel like, and taking this moment to sort of remember and mourn that does feel like another complicating factor of the different factions, even of groups within ethnic groups, Indian groups within Canada, and how David Eby is going to manage this with a complicated layer of Donald Trump, and then the political powerhouse that is Surrey. Any thoughts on how he's handling it so far?
Well, I think he's doing the best he can, but the problem that provincial politicians face is that they may see shortcomings in the federal law, which I think Eby clearly does with bail and a number of the other issues that have floated up from the fentanyl crisis. But it's also extremely difficult for a political leader to say, my priority now is to clean up extortion, because you can't give political direction to the police. And I think that's one of the areas that has to be sorted out. Like, people do expect David Eby to be accountable for extortion problems in the province of BC, and they expect that somehow there's a connection that's appropriate between the elected officials and the police. And it's harder to set up than you would think, particularly when many of the agencies on the police side in BC are in different parts of the kind of jurisdictional universe. Some may be municipal, some may be RCMP detachments at a municipal level, and some may be national police agencies run by the RCMP. It's a mess, and it's good for transnational crime. We punch way above our weight on transnational crime, whether you're looking at connections to India or to China or to just our own homegrown system, which is extremely effective and devastating and drives about 40% of our murder rate. So it's a problem.
Yeah. And Kate, you touched on the Air India thing, and I'll just acknowledge that former Premier Ujjal Dosanjh, was in the news the last couple of days talking about how that tragedy 40 years ago really doesn't get the attention it deserves as a Canadian tragedy. It was characterized at the time as kind of, well, this affects people from India, but it was Canadians on that plane that died. And so it's important that we continue to
talk about it,
honor their memory,
talk
and
about it. Yeah.
And that was a terrorist threat originated in British Columbia,
right,
by perpetrators from British Columbia who blew up that plane. And that's that's something we can't lose sight of. Yeah.
We have it here. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Can I move us along to talk, to bring us actually to, we have a clipping this week. So our clipping this week, I'm going to say congratulations to John Rustad, because he is the author of our, I'll call it our clipping, our unorthodox clipping this week. And I'm referring to the 4-page email he sent to caucus, alleging that some of the former MLAs who left the party are blackmailing staff into conservative staff into taking jobs and defecting and moving over to them. I'll quote directly from it just quickly from Rustad's letter. From what I have been told, the threat is framed something like, we will pay you handsomely to join us, and we will damage you if you refuse. A lot of the rest of the letter too, and I think part of why it's 4 pages long, is he spends a lot of time defending the leadership review process. I'm curious, Mike, from your standpoint, like acknowledging, I think Rustad's in a tough spot with some of the internal dynamics of his party right now, and the leadership review coming up. Was it the right move to send a lengthy letter email to everyone in caucus about this with these allegations?
Don't write something if a conversation can do it. Don't talk to someone if a wink will do it. Like generally in these types of issues, the less paper trail, the better, in my opinion. But I feel like it was an emotional letter,
Mm.
and I maybe it had to be sent to corral people. It's
Hmm.
never good when the dirty laundry is out in public. But the other thing I'll say though is I don't know that Rustad's in serious jeopardy at all within the
Okay.
Conservatives. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe I'm missing the plot here, but I feel like he has a pretty strong grip on the party.
Even in
And
that onerous long leadership
well,
review
I think
process they
sometimes
have.
these situations happen, and political opponents seize on them and point fingers and say they're in disarray, and it's a bit of a can be a bit of a tempest in a teapot. And I would caution NDPers or people who want Rustad out, and just unless the numbers are there in the among the membership or in the caucus to get rid of Rustad, he's not going anywhere. And right now, I think he has the support of most of the caucus, and he probably has the support of the membership that's there, unless someone's been signing up lots of new members, and I don't think they have been. So um,
Let's accept
we'll
that to be
see.
true, though. It looks like he's got some real, I mean, I think to your point, this letter felt kind of personal. I think he's got some real
Yeah.
problems in the three defectors and the relations between the two groups.
Well, I think the three defectors are gone. Probably good riddance. And
But they're not going to make his life any easier, even though
yeah,
they're not in the
but
party, right?
well, as I said last week, is that maybe they're going to make him look a little more sane because they're crazy.
Yeah.
It'll
Yeah.
be not literally, but perception.
Mhm.
But you know, the important thing for Rustad is he, has to prosecute the government and do a good job of bringing the government down. It's less important that he raises his party up. He's got to bring the government down. That's what oppositions do. And it's a bit messy, and he will have to show progress. And there was a LinkedIn post this morning put out by a prominent developer, Ryan Beatty, prominent businessman, who is calling for the Conservatives to basically move to the middle and embrace more people in the middle of the spectrum, former BC Liberal types who haven't gone over to the Conservatives yet. I thought that was interesting because Brian doesn't normally intervene like that.
Mhm.
And that's to me that's maybe even more impactful than whatever the sideshow is over here with inside the Conservative Party. What's happening outside the Conservative Party that might exert pressure on them. So, you
Okay.
know,
Well, it was surprising to me how quickly some of the mainstream press gallery reporters followed on the heels of this. This story was broken by Wolfgang Deppner from Canadian Press.
yeah,
And then others chimed in, including Keith Baldry, who endorsed a comment from Jas Johal at CKNW saying that there was turmoil in the leadership. There could
yeah.
be, a special caucus meeting. So I was surprised. Like Mike, I thought having the three leave was probably good news for Rustad, but there seems to be more smoke than I would have expected, and perhaps there's
Yeah.
more
Well,
fire too.
I think there's always a bit of a whirl on these things that maybe there's more smoke than fire. So anyway, we'll
Time will
see.
tell. Time will tell. All right. We were gonna touch on public sector bargaining. I'm just gonna say real quick, let's come back to this next week. I think there's an offer out there from the government that's likely to get rejected and give us reason to keep talking. Do either of you need to wait on this real quickly
Oh,
before we
just
move to the
there's a
main?
good Von Palmer column on it this week, and
Perfect. Yeah.
that spells out the fiscal implications of it.
Portrait and yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I don't think there'll be a settlement at this level. It's obviously the opening offer. So yes, we have lots
Yeah.
more time to talk about it.
There we go. There we go. Let's use our time and let's grab a drink. Chef, are you kicking us off this week?
Yeah, wasn't sure whether to even do this because it's a serious topic, but we've talked about a few of those. I just wanted to point briefly to the case of Josie Osborne and a young woman named Charlie Pollock, who is just about 9 years old and has a degenerative condition which requires drug treatment. Last week, Josie Osborne, as minister, exercised her authority, which she must do, to cut off medication to this child, and there was a lot of coverage of it. I don't want to go
Mm.
back through the whole case. It's a tragic case, but the minister's advice from an expert panel was that continuing this treatment at $1 million a year, which has already been in place for 6 years, would not prolong her life, and therefore they recommended against it. I just wanted to sort of, I guess, raise a glass, but not in any kind of a celebratory way, because this is one of the toughest real life decisions that a cabinet minister will ever make, and I just wanted to say to people that in watching politics for a long time, being close to it, I don't know. And Adrian Dix had to do this many times. Now it's fallen to Josie Osborne. Probably in children and families, there are similar cases. But when you're thinking that it's all, when you're frustrated with politicians and are critical of how they behave, think about some of the jobs they do on our behalf. This is one of the toughest of all. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I think Josie Osborne made her comments were obviously heartfelt, and she was prepared to be more up. She took it very straightforwardly and empathetically, and I just wanted to say I was thinking of her. I guess that's it.
Yeah.
But a very interesting and human case that is one of those tough decisions politicians make sometimes.
Thanks, Geoff. Mike,
I'm going to take a shot at Adrian Dix. Who thought that he could come in, that he could come in and filibuster Hotel Pacifico. You can filibuster the House. We'll let you do it this one time, Adrian, but there won't be any more filibustering again. I can tell you that much. We're going to hold you down in future interviews to shorter, pithier answers. But also, Adrian, it'd be nice if you recommended a book that was from the 21st century. That would also be good, although I'm glad.
Oh boy, Mike.
Glad that Geoff made the list. So anyways, there, Adrian Dix, double shot, boom, boom. And next run for Glenn Clark, boom.
Oh my gosh, no ghost is safe, or no guest is safe as soon as they leave. Get stabbed in the back by Mike McDonald. All right. I'll bring us back to a topic we covered too. I just wanted to give a shout out to Angus Reid, who did some polling related to the Air India disaster that I thought was really thoughtful. In particular, looking at some other tragedies, smaller on scale, mostly white victims, and sort of just the outsized place they have in people and Canadians' minds compared to the Air India tragedy. And I think quantifying something I think that we know is there, but we don't always get to quantify. So I think that was good work by a pollster. So my glass is raised to the Angus Reid Institute and to Shachi Curl. Whew. All right, here we are. That's another one in the bag. I want to thank Minister Dix for joining us. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, Fortis BC, the Health Sciences Association of British Columbia, and the BC School Trustees Association. We will see you next week, guests. BC, you can never leave.